Welcome to episode 31 of the Total Hockey Training Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Scahan. Before I introduce my next guest, I just want to remind everybody that Total Hockey Training, the year-round training plan for any hockey player all over the world, is available. Right now, we're rolling in our preseason phase, and it is going phenomenal, getting a lot of good quality feedback from the athletes that are on the platform. My next guest, I have to put my glasses on here. My next guest is Scotty Livingston. Scotty's a longtime friend and an early mentor of mine, just a great human being. And I'm going to read his bio. This is an unbelievable bio, by the way. Scott is a master of reconditioning, designer of human and organizational performance solutions, keynote speaker, podcast host, educator, and mentor who has worked in the high-performance sports world for more than 30 years. As a performance coach and therapist, he is known for his dedication to building more efficient, effective, and resilient athletes. Scott has trained and rebuilt athletes at every level and has personally trained multiple Olympic and World Cup medalists. He worked for 11 seasons in the National Hockey League as an athletic therapist and strength and conditioning coach with the Montreal Canadiens, New York Rangers, and New York Islanders. His newest passion, well, I shouldn't say it's new, but his passion is his podcast, Leave Your Mark, where he interviews people from all walks of human performance, exploring their personal life stories. He's a dedicated and loving son, husband, father, and a friend, and his purpose is to inspire people, create change, and challenge convention through his own example and mentorship. Scotty, that's an awesome bio, and I had to read that one. How you doing, pal?
I'm good, buddy. It's good to be with you. I'm really happy to spend some time with you and catch up. You're doing some great stuff, Sean, and you always have done, and it's always been a treat to chat when we've had a chance. So thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for being here. I think the listeners are really going to appreciate this one. So, Scotty, tell us about yourself. Where are you from? I guess I never found that out from you along our paths. I guess I always assumed you were from the Montreal area, but I could be wrong. So please tell us about you, where you grew up and where you're from and all that.
It's funny when you said that because I remember coming back from the Rangers to the Canadians, and I'm pretty sure for about a year people thought I was American because I had
Yeah.
worked for the Rangers. But yeah, I grew up in Ottawa. I grew up in the capital of Canada, and was there for most of my childhood. My father was a diplomat actually, and I lived in Singapore as a baby and London, England, from about 9 to 11, and then came back to Canada. Grew up in the East End of Ottawa, played football, hockey, baseball, and then went to University of Concordia in Montreal, and then made Montreal my home after that for quite a few years until I got in the NHL and went to New York. So that's kind of my background in terms of living places.
Okay. Well, what talk about your athletic life when you were younger? Like you played multiple sports. I love that.
Yeah, it's funny. I was more of a football guy than a hockey guy. And I think I would have been more of a hockey guy than a football guy, except for just circumstances of life. Like I said, my dad was a diplomat. And so as a kid, I loved hockey like every other Canadian kid did, and started playing hockey when I was about 4 or 5 years old. And in those days, you used to play in outdoor rinks a lot as a development kid, and then finally sort of graduate and go into indoor rinks. But I remember playing recreational sort of hockey, little kids hockey, outdoors for a long time, and I was into it with all my buddies. And then my father took a posting to England. He worked in the diplomatic corps, and we were part of the Canadian consulate in London. And so, for 3 years, I didn't really play much sport. Actually, I kind of got introduced to soccer and rugby a bit over there, but in general, not really. And so when I came back, my skating wasn't where it needed to be to be able to be competitive. So I just played recreational rec hockey for probably about 6, 7 years. But then, because I was a big kid, was always kind of stocky and thick, and strong, and so I always had an interest in football. And so football league was kind of blowing up in Ottawa at the time, and I jumped into it and actually had a pretty good affinity for it. Played both sides of the line, played a lot of line positions. And for my age, I was a big kid, but I never really grew vertically as much as I would have liked to. But I was a pretty good football player. I played at fairly high level. I played for a select team in midget football in Ottawa, and then on the all-star team in high school. And then I was recruited to play football at university. But that's where I would say, sporting life changed because as I said, I didn't grow vertically, but I'd always played line positions. And when I went to Concordia, I was recruited to play, but I was 5'9.5", 210, and the guys on the line, the average line position at Concordia at the time was their average weight was 280, 6'4". They were the biggest line in Canada, and all five guys got drafted to the CFL, one to the NFL. So I was just like, no, this is not going to happen. And I wasn't a great student, so I gave up football. But the irony of that in the background was I always lifted weights and I was strength trained. So I was strength training when strength training, there was no National Strength and Conditioning Association, and there was no sort of direction on that. And so that would have been in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And then because I'd kind of always worked out, I kind of had an interest in it and got into athletic therapy and always kept strength training, and actually discovered the NSCA very, like, by happenstance. I was at a YMCA in Montreal training in probably 1986, 7, and saw the journal, the NSCA journal, on one of the tables, and kind of went over and looked at it. And I'm kind of in university at the time, kind of the back end of my university, and I'm kind of, well, this is cool. I didn't realize there was an organization that accredited this position.
Mhm.
And at the time, I was going to become an athletic therapist, athletic trainer. For those of you listening in the United States, in Canada, athletic therapists a little bit different. There's more of a clinical paradigm associated with them as well, but that's where I was going. And then I was like, well, maybe I'll become a member of this NSCA. So I kind of did a dual thing right from the beginning. I sort of kind of beelined for getting myself certified in both. And so by 1989, 90, I was certified as an AT and a strength coach. And that's kind of how my sports career influenced my professional career.
That's awesome. So it's funny that you mentioned bumping into that NSCA journal because I did that as well in the university at University of Massachusetts at Boston when I was originally an athletic training student, which is the athletic therapist, I guess, role in Canada.
Mhm.
And I bumped into a strength and conditioning journal, and there was an article in there. The head strength and conditioning coach at Purdue University wrote an article, and I was a big Mike Allstott fan back then because I played football at the university at the
Mhm.
time. And that's when I was like, wow, this is a profession, designing strength and conditioning programs. And back then, helping develop people like Mike Allstott. So I thought that was cool. And that's funny you mentioned bumping into that journal. So that's great. So you became an athletic therapist. How did you transition from university to the Islanders?
Yeah, well, as I said, I became an AT and a strength coach around the same time. And to be honest with you, at that time, especially in Canada, I know it was a little bit different in the States. The I would call the American sports medicine and performance industry is probably 20 years older than the Canadian one. It
Mhm.
really started to blow up at the NSCA level in the 70s and 80s. In Canada, it was more like late 80s, 90s into the 2000s. And so when I was kind of coming into that world, it was very small. The sports medicine world was very small. Literally in Montreal, there were maybe 15 certified athletic therapists, and very few sports medicine physios, and very few clinics. All these kinds of things that now are kind of the norm were very small. And so the good side of it was you had this kind of whiteboard to maybe create your career in. The bad side was there were not that many people to look towards to kind of carve or craft who you were going to be or what you were going to become. So I finished university and started working in a couple of private clinics. And one of the problems with AT from a clinical paradigm in Canada is it's not as recognized from an insurance perspective. And I think it's the same sort of problem in the States to a degree. But so you couldn't really bill for your services. And what I was always finding was I was either going to have to kind of have my work co-signed by a physio, or it was just not a an inspiring career at the time to work in a clinic, but I couldn't find a job in an institution because the classic AT position is working in universities, high schools, sports, but Canada is a much smaller footprint of those kinds of spaces. And at that time, to be honest with you, really there were university jobs in AT, yeah, but there wasn't any. Junior hockey didn't have professional ATs. Even the NHL at the time,
Mhm.
when I came into the NHL into Canada, I'm not sure that any Canadian team actually had a certified athletic trainer working for them. They often had guys who had kind of dabbled in a whole bunch of emergency care and different things, and now were, so-called the trainer for the team.
Mhm.
So, it wasn't like there was all these jobs.
Yeah.
So at the same time, I saw this NSCA thing, got certified as a strength coach, and to your point, discovered that there was an actual profession there, but in Canada, there was no profession there. So one day I started to get kind of despondent about, was I going to have a career? Could I actually pay my bills? What was I going to do? I sort of semi quit doing it for about 6 to 8 months in early 1990. I'd finished school. I left the clinic I was in, couldn't keep me employed because they couldn't, because of some circumstances around billing. A friend of mine was opening a sports store in the West End of Montreal. So I went and became a sports store manager.
Mhm.
And I'm managing this sports store. And a buddy of mine who was the head therapist, who I had interned under, was the head therapist at Concordia, walks in the door and says, I'm thinking about hiring an assistant AT. And we started talking about some people at the time because we had worked with a lot of students who might be good for it. But then I looked at them, and I had gotten certified with the NSCA about 6 months earlier. And I said, the football team's always had a little bit of a strength coach. What do you think about hiring me as the assistant therapist and strength coach, and maybe creating a position there? And he's like, yeah, maybe we could do that. So I actually quit my job and went on unemployment insurance for a year and worked for 5K while I was on unemployment insurance. And they paid was my first ex-wife at the time. They paid her the 5K so that I could stay on unemployment insurance for a year.
Wow.
Probably shouldn't be announcing that to the federal government, but I did that for a year so I could work and get my job started. So I created this job at Concordia and started working there. Each year, it would kind of, we'd be able to get a little bit more money for the job, a little bit more money for the job. And over 8 years that I was there, I kind of crafted this role as a strength coach. And during that time was the same time that, the NHL was starting to, hire more guys and hire strength coaches. I know you had Lauren, and I think you had Pete Twist on your thing already. And both of those guys were guys of my generation, but they had gotten into the National Hockey League a little earlier. I'd gone the university route. And so
Mhm.
we all knew each other. We were all talking with one another. And I would talk to them about what they were doing and how they were getting into it. And I could see the league was starting to spool up a little bit. And so I started talking to the head trainer at the Montreal Canadiens about, what do you think? Would the Canadians want to hire somebody? Again, the Canadian teams were behind the American teams in sort of engaging this. Pete Twist was the first guy, but Pete was a lone wolf for, I would say, probably 10 years. Lauren, when you talk to Lauren, a lot of his jobs were not in Canada. They were in Chicago, St. Louis, all these teams. And then when those Canadian teams started, probably in the later 90s, to hire people. Obviously, Goldie came back and worked for Ottawa, and later, after I left the Canadians, he worked for the Canadians. But I talked to the Canadians guys, and the head trainer at the time was a guy named Gay Talonfave. He was not certified as an AT at the time. And he was like, no, there's no job here. They don't have a role. But he happened to be in 1998, he was at the NHL draft, and he was talking to a guy named Mike Santos, who was the assistant GM for the New York Islanders at the time. And the Islanders had just had a new ownership group come in who had a big football background. And if you ever watch ESPN 30 on 30, there's actually a story about the guy who tried to buy the Islanders the year before I came to the team. So he
Hmm.
tries to buy the team. He had no money. He faked it and basically fooled everybody into believing that he had enough money to own the team. And there's this big, big story around the baloney that it was that he duped everybody. Long story short, this new owner came in and bought the team, and so they wanted to bring in a strength conditioning coach in a different way and do things in a different way. It had what they had there hadn't been successful up until then, and so I get Santos. Gates actually said to Santos, you might want to talk to this guy, Scott Livingston. So I get back from the NSCA conference, and on my message machine at the time. I pushed play, and Richie Campbell. I don't know if you ever met Richie in your time, but Richie was the head therapist of the Islanders for many years. He's now at Portland in
Yeah.
junior
Hmm.
hockey. And Richie's on the other end, and he has a kind of like a little kind of a funny, squirrely voice. He's like, "Hey, Scotty, Rich Campbell here. Wondering if you want to come down and interview for a job for the strength coach for a team." And I'm like, wow, is this for real? So I phone him back and he's like, yeah, we want to interview you. So literally 2 days later, they fly me down. I've never been to New York before. I land, I get in a limo out to Long Island, go to the old rink that they have there, which I'm sure you've been in a few times.
Yeah.
Walk in, nobody's there. It's the summertime. It's absolutely empty. I can't find anybody. I finally kind of bust into a couple of rooms and Richie's unpacking boxes. And I go, looking for Richie Campbell. He's like, oh, Scotty. Yeah. I'm like, yeah. He goes, come on with me. So he walks me around. It's a gong show. The space has got boxes everywhere. It's mid off season when all the gear's coming in and everything else. So he kind of chats with me, then he takes me to talk to the assistant GM, and the assistant GM or the GM is like assistant GM's kind of telling me about their background and what they're doing. So then he wanted me to go and interview with the chief physician, which is a guy named Elliot Pellman. So if you've ever seen Concussion, Elliot Pellman was the chief internist for the NFL, but he was also the Islanders
Okay.
internist. And he ran the sports medicine group around the team. So I went out and met Elliot and had an interview. And at the end of the interview, Elliot offered me the job. He said, do you want this job? Da 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 da. Kind of framed out what the salary was going to be, et cetera. And I'm like, yeah, I'd be really keen to do it. And he goes, and I said, when do you need me? And he goes, well, when are you available? And or he says, when can you come down? I said, well, I can probably come down in about 2 weeks if you need it or whatever. And he goes, we need you Monday. This was Saturday. So I had to fly back to Montreal, or to my home, get a whole bunch of clothes because I knew I was going to be
Yeah.
away for, I think, 3 weeks to do training camp. Flew back and did training camp. So that's how kind of my Islanders career started. And I could tell you many, many stories off the back of that, but that's how I got into the NHL.
I love that. And that's a great story. I love stories like that. And for the listeners, I think it's important to just recognize the fact that what you did with that unemployment insurance and started a job and built yourself up. And people need to realize that without a guy like Scotty undertaking that role and starting that program at Concordia, and I assume that when you left, it became a full-time position, correct?
Yeah, well, Reg Grant took the position after I left. So
Oh, Reg.
Reggie.
Yeah.
Reggie was a student at Concordia when I was at Concordia, and Reg interned under me. Did the same sort of thing. Was inspired to become an AT. Kind of inspired to become a strength coach. He did both things, and he interned under me for a few years. Then he left the school and went off and did a bunch of different things himself. And when I decided to take the job with the Islanders, Reg came back and took my job and continued to grow it. And then I left. Ironically, I left the Islanders after a year, became the head strength coach for the Rangers, did that for 2 years. Again, I'm skipping lots of stories, but when I left the Rangers, I came back and they Slats released me because I'd had 2 years of my contract. My contract was finished. He said, I'm not firing you. I'm just not hiring you again. He wanted to make some changes, the way the business works.
Mhm.
So I came back to Montreal and they had replaced me with a guy, but it really didn't work out. And so um, a year and a half later, Pete, and I think Reg has told you this story, but Pete Friesen rolls into Montreal to play a game, and Freezer calls me and Reggie and says, do you guys want to go for dinner? So he picks up Reg, and on the way down to pick up me, or I think Reg picked up Pete, and they were driving in a car, and they came down to my apartment, and on the way down, Pete tells Reg that the Rangers have fired the guy that they had replaced me with, and would he like Reg to pump his tires for the Rangers job? And Reg's like, yeah, I'd love to do that. So then Pete pushed Reggie in that role to come back. So Reg left the Concordia and became the strength coach for the Rangers, and then had his
Wow.
17-year career. So that's kind of
Yeah.
a legacy proposition there for sure.
That's a great story because actually Pete was instrumental in me getting hired by Anaheim back in
Mm.
2002.
Yeah,
That's
Peter's an incredible guy. Like I was really lucky in the early days meeting a guy like Pete Friesen was inspiring. Pete's just a few years older than me. Pete Twist, Lauren, Charles Poliquin, these guys were all kind of like at the front end of the business. I was kind of front end in the university sector, and we were all kind of doing our thing. And it was a very small nucleus of practitioners in Canada that were doing it. And so you kind of had the white canvas to create as you wish to.
Mhm.
When I was at Concordia, like I went, like I said, from no salary to a reasonable salary by the end, created a full-time role. And during the whole time, I would run beer bashes twice a year so I could raise cash that I used because there was no budget to fix up the weight room. We had an 800 square foot weight room. So I would, make $1,500 on a weekend to do a school party with all the athletes and stuff. And that front door money I would take and buy steel plates and bars and pieces of equipment. And over the years, I sort of built the gym at Concordia, so there was a real training space there. So everywhere I've sort of gone in my career, it's always been a thematic. I've sort of and it's something that I enjoy is just the crafting of the position rather than having the position defined by somebody else to me. I'd rather define it myself, which
Mhm.
to the point of what you said to me before you came on, like I think that was what it was attractive to me being in the league was always having sort of a white canvas to create. And when I didn't have a white canvas to create and I was kind of constrained, it was less fun.
Mhm. Oh, that makes total sense. Now, one quick thing on Concordia. What was the name of the individual that hired you at Concordia? Because I believe I forget his name.
There's a guy named Ron Rappel. Reggie
Correct.
would talk
Yeah.
about him too. Ron had graduated Concordia about 3 years earlier than me. He's about 3 years older than me, and he was the first full time hire as an AT at Concordia. He I interned under him for a year or two, and then went off to clinical practice. And like I said, I'm almost quit the industry when he was willing to take this risk and see if we could figure something out. And we did. And if it wasn't for him, and you know maybe a very lucky meeting at a sports store one day when he walked in, I don't know if I'd still be doing this. Like, it's funny how life
Okay.
is like that.
Mhm.
There's these little moments you can look back on and say, would I have stayed in the industry? Because I was honestly at a place where just before seeing Ron that day, I was thinking about going back to Ottawa and doing something different. And who knows what that would have been or what it would have turned into. But I was very close to not remaining in Montreal.
That's awesome. And one thing I remember about Ron was that he was instrumental in helping the strength and conditioning coaches of the NHL with he gave a presentation. It might have been live and in person about proving your value to general
Mm,
managers and negotiations of contracts. I thought that was awesome when he did that. And I also want to mention about, you know, you always have these choices in life and you can always go one way or the other. And a lot of times when you end up making the right choices, right? And
mhm,
building building upon what you are set out to do. I really believe in that. So that's just
mhm,
great. So
mhm,
I remember when I was just first getting started, I remember someone had attended a hockey training conference that you organized. I want to say early 2000s, early
No, it
2000.
was 98 and 99. I did
Yeah.
one in 98 and one in 99, and Reggie helped me with the second one. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember someone went to it and I remember taking that book, pamphlet, binder, whatever it was, and taking it right to the copy machine and making my own. And you had guys like Pete,
Mhm.
I want to say Boyle was there too. And it was just like for hockey strength and conditioning, especially a quote up and coming person like myself. I was just immersed in that thing. I remembered all the slides and I just remember like I need to get in touch with you. And I think I originally first got in touch with you when I was working at Boston College. We had a young player, JD Forrest, good little defenseman. He had he skates a skate severed his wrist, and this
Mm,
kid was done for months. And I remember our head coach was like, "Hey, I want to say Donald Audette had the same thing
mm.
happen in
Yeah,
Montreal." I
yeah,
was like, "You got to call the guys in Montreal." So I picked up the phone and called you and talked to you about it. You probably
right.
don't remember that, but I do. But talk about that conference you put on and how, I for me it was inspiring to see, okay, these one, you can potentially work in the NHL someday, and two, like it was just educational, you know, it was just awesome. So talk about that.
Yeah.
But
Well, I was actually talking about this in my mentorship group the other day about volunteerism. And back in the early 90s, when I was with a member of the Canadian Athletic Therapist Association, I started working in the education committee. And in the Canadian Athletic Therapist Association, it used to be that each provincial organization would sort of take the national conference on and kind of run the conference. So every year it would kind of move from place to place. And in 92, it was in Montreal. And so Ron and myself co-chaired the conference and ran it. And then we did it again in 96. So I'd had this really unique experience of organizing events back in the day and kind of getting over the trepidation of, what's involved, how do you market it, how do you organize it, all that kind of stuff. So nearing the end of my time at Concordia, and again, funny things happen. The Concordia was trying to get new facilities. It hadn't had great facilities for a long time, and there was a student referendum to see if the students would, support paying part of their tuition to build this new athletic complex. And we were all jazzed up to make it happen, and it didn't happen. And so at that point, I started to become despondent about, what's my future in this position? There's no growth in it. And so that's when I started kind of looking towards the NHL. And always had a hockey interest. As I said, I was a football guy, loved playing football. And in fact, if I was to say, what was my goal was to someday work in the NFL. Love the Pittsburgh Steelers. If I had a story to tell, it would be that I had become the head trainer or strength coach for the Steelers. But it was a harder thing to do. So I started looking in the NHL, and I also we had a good hockey team, and I said, I know all these guys like Lauren and Pete, and why don't I organize a conference to bring the hockey people together? And I'd met Mike kind of circuitously, at a Perform Better summit. I didn't know him super well, but was inspired by some of the stuff he was doing as well. So call out to these different people and say, hey, would you come to Montreal and do this conference? And we ran the conference, and as you said, Boyle was there, Twist was there, Goldie was there. I I don't think on the first one Reggie did a presentation, but on the second one, I mean, he was a young pup at the time. He did something at the second one that we did. And I can't remember all the guys that I had there, but I had a really rich group of people, um, you know, uh, who were kind of just setting the table of strength and conditioning in the industry at the time. And then I ran it again the following year. Reg helped me with it. We did it at McGill University, and I actually was talking to Mike about that because Mike had his first child somewhere around then. And I'll always remember watching him and Cindy. Cindy was pushing a pram up this hill at McGill, like with the little one, and Mike was a new father and all this kind of stuff. And now his kids are all grown up. But we were doing these presentations, and Chris Poirier, who I'd gotten to know at Perform Better, He brought gear up, and we had all the toys and all this kind of stuff. And so I was starting to get to know people. And then after the first one, that summer was when I got the job with the Islanders. So then the next year I came back to Montreal and did it again. But then it just became too much to organize because of my role in the NHL. I just didn't have the bandwidth to keep running it. So I let it go, and we can get into it later. But as you know, rebooted it back a few years
Mhm.
ago, pre-COVID. But it was really cool because it was really the first. The NSCA was doing some sort of, they do a lecture or two at the conference, or I remember, I think I was listening to you, Goldie's conversation with you, and I know Pete, him, and Klinger did some stuff at the
Yeah,
NSCA and hockey and stuff, but there was really no coalescence around, who's into hockey, what are they doing. So this was, to my knowledge, one of the first, hockey specific conferences. And I still get people who said to me, "Oh yeah, I was at that conference in '98 or '99, and we had a good social and all this other stuff."
awesome.
So it was a great experience, and it probably supported, again, my growth and development in hockey in a big way.
That's awesome. And I want to ask you about this. So, what did you do during the lockout in 0405?
Oh 04, oh 05, had already come back to Montreal, was working for the Canadians. I came back 01, 01, oh 02 season, and in 04, I had recently started a small business with my future wife, um, and I was starting to get asked a lot by people externally to see if I could work with them a little bit. I didn't really have a place to work with them or what to do. I didn't want to do it on a full-time scale, but I wanted to have sort of a little laboratory where I could do some external work and not always be working with hockey players, and maybe also work with some hockey guys in the off season and stuff in the future. After losing my job in Montreal, I always felt, or in New York, I always felt like I should have a bit of a plan B, like what if, So started this uh, clinical training space, and so when the lockout happened, I just kind of put myself into that space and started working with some private clients, and also with guys who were still in town, would come and train with me there. And I did that for a year. It's also the first year that my wife and I taught the practice that we do, reconditioning, in its sort of fetus state at the time. So I did some teaching, and also had my stag from my wedding, which went to this. A buddy of mine had this really cool hunting lodge, so I rented the hunting lodge from him. Had 15 guys up there. There was an ice pad on the back that this guy put on the lake.
Mhm.
So we literally played hockey all day, cold ones in the snow. It was like something out of a Canadian storybook,
It's awesome.
skated. I brought practice jerseys up from the Canadians, and it was a cool thing. So I did my stag in February because we were still locked out. So that's what I occupied my time with. Kind of started our business while I had the time to do it.
That's awesome. And so interesting that you are an athletic therapist and a strength and conditioning coach. I guess my question is, how did you, because I've been in it a long time, there are, when I first started, there were silos in the NHL. You had your athletic
Mhm.
trainer, you had your strength and conditioning coach. How did you blend the two professions, I guess, and do what you did?
Well, I really started doing it almost right away, and because I was forced to put both hats on and do that on a regular basis every day in the circumstances I was in. I was acting as a therapist in a more classic therapeutic role, and then I would walk in the gym and build strength conditioning programming for guys. Early influences in strength conditioning were all the classics, the Kramers and Paul Quinn and all these guys who I was reading and kind of learning to periodize and build programming. I'd already always lifted myself, but then now is learning sort of called the scientific background noise to doing all this stuff as it was at the time. Um, but what I found was I was trained. I would say through the '90s, I trained guys as a classic strength conditioning coach would train guys, for football, the bench, squat, clean, all these things were important lifts. I would have the guys working on their best lifts. I created a thing called the Superman T-shirt and had a really low level set of software back in the day where I could jam the numbers in, create an avatar for each position, and sort of say if you made more than 1,000 points on this, for all the tests that you would do. So receivers had different weighting on their tests than linemen did. You would get this Superman T-shirt, and the guys just loved that, and they were all jammed up about that. But I would train the guys as a strength coach. As a strength coach, learned about speed and all that stuff, and on the other side, to be a therapist. But then I started to recognize um, I always remember I got Coach Parker's training manual one year, who was this is a legend of strength conditioning, as you well know,
Mm-hmm.
and he had a very specific uh, training strategy for the anaerobic and speed side of the game where instead of having guys just running 40s and 30s and 60s and hundreds and all this stuff, he would have guys run routes or pattern acquisition that they would do, like a defensive back would do backpedal work, sprint forward, a quarterback would roll out. So it was very specific kind of design for how he wanted guys to train, and it kind of started to click to me that having more linkage to what the person did was an interesting sort of side of the equation of how to train guys. So that got me started looking at the way people moved more. And then I ran into Gray Cook, and I watched Lee and Gray do their FMS, the first FMS, when they introduced the FMS to the NSCA in 1996 in Vegas. I was at that presentation. And at that time, I had started doing kind of a screen. I used to have people do a step up onto a box, a step down, a squat, push up, a bunch of different things. And I would look at them do this and see where their sort of deficits in movement were. And then I saw them introduce that, and I was like, wow, somebody else who thinks like me. This is really interesting. I got to know Gray, went down, and he actually, I don't know if you were in the NHL at the time when they linked up with Reebok and they brought all the NHL strength coaches and ATs to Dallas, and they did this Reebok FMS kind of education symposium. I think it would have been in 2000 or
With
something
the
like that.
core board, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And so
yeah.
they did this whole thing and went down there, and I was getting to know those guys more and more, and I was kind of operating the way I was operating, and it was influencing me. And I actually used to always ask Ray when I would have him. I brought him up to Canada about 3 times and had him up for the hockey thing, I think the second time. And I asked him, what do you I see this as your input screen concept for strength and conditioning, but what do you do from a clinical paradigm? Like what do you do as a therapist? And he would sort of always blow off my question. What I came to understand was that he didn't really have a clinical process, and then he ran into Greg Rose. And Greg had kind of created the SFMA. And
Yes.
so the two of them started brainstorming around stuff. And that's when those guys kind of hooked up and kind of created these two thought processes, the FMS for the strength conditioning industry and the SFMA for the clinical industry. And they always kind of broadcast them and define them as a screen. But I was early enough into all of this and started to recognize that, there were weaknesses in the strategy in the sense that you were, and Gray completely acknowledges this, his intent for the FMS was to that it just simply be like taking a blood pressure. You recognize you have high blood pressure. It doesn't tell you why you do, but it tells you better maybe take a bigger look. And that was the intent of the FMS in its early. But I think some people kind of extrapolated and started to make it an assessment and
Hmm.
started to pin the tail on too much of a donkey around that. And then some people got irritated with it, then started talking about whether you could prevent injuries by doing it, and it kind of got down a bad rabbit hole. But the actual intent of it was, let's start looking at movement more. And I was looking at movement more and more and more and starting to recognize that you had to sort of look at what your athlete did with their body and then take some kind of template to look at global movement and kind of ask yourself, based on the way this person moves globally, what do I think they're going to move like in their real life
Hmm.
paradigm? And so that continued to kind of fester in me as I was working. And when I was working for the Habs, as I said, I started this business with my wife, and I started working with, so I'd worked in university with a whole bunch of different kinds of sports. Then I worked in hockey. And the irony is, when I was in university, I was the football guy. Then I went into hockey and I was the hockey guy. Then I left hockey and I was the Olympic guy. And I'm like all these different things. But I've always been interested in athleticism and sports. So that side job allowed me to start looking at a lot of different sports athletes. And I started to get involved with a group that helped build an Olympic support, performance support group. And I started working with bobsledders and different kinds of skiers and judo athletes and divers. And seeing all these different athletes, I started to recognize that the portfolio of movements were different. You know, the American sort of construct is the big four, and they're all kind of the same. You've got basketball, football, hockey. It's always sort of a multi-directional forward movement sort of strategy, right?
Mhm.
But then when you start looking at sports like diving, that, you know, that's a whole different animal, right? Judo, it's a whole different animal. Combatives, different animal. So you start looking at these things, and they start to make you a better observer of movement leaks, observer of movement holes. And so then that sort of informed the way I started to practice more and more, both as a strength coach and a therapist. And I don't really differentiate the two things for myself anymore. They're just one
Mhm.
symbiotic reality for me. It's like, it just depends on the project that is in front of me. If I have a very healthy, high functioning, well moving athlete, I'm going to train them to perform. If I have an athlete that has holes in the way they move, I'm going to clean that up while I'm training them to perform. If I have an athlete who's broken and I have to fix him, I'm going to fix him and then clean him up and then train him to perform. So that's kind of the way my practice kind of grew over time.
I love that. That's awesome. Now I remember when if I was with the Ducks, when I was with the Ducks back then, we'd come up to Montreal and I'd ask the room attendant, whether that was Pierre or someone, and they, hey, can you grab Scott Livingston for me to say hello? And you were on the ice. And I like, to me, that was a shift in my approach too, because I'm like, oh, he's on the ice with the guys. And I'm like, I can't freaking skate. And I should be, we have players. This is back then. This is before skating coaches were employed by teams, and there was no one doing it. And so
Mhm.
we had some unfortunate injuries probably back in 2008. I just jumped on the ice. I said, okay, there's three or four guys here that need to be skating. And I'll never forget that. I jumped on the ice. It was French Canadian guy, Francois Beauchemin, tore his ACL. And I was on the ice with this guy 6 days a week. I actually asked management if I could stay home from road trips to get him ready, because he was a big part. Because what I remember about working with injured players, there was always that, oh, there's no way he's coming back.
Mhm.
There's no way he's coming back this year. And this guy worked his nuts off and came back. Surgery was in December. He came back in March, played 5 games in the regular season, and he was an absolute horse in the playoffs. I'll never forget that, just to be a part of that process where I was kind of like, we had a head athletic trainer. I don't even, yeah, we had a head athletic trainer. We had an assistant athletic trainer. We had me, and that's all we had. He saw a physical therapist, on days after he was done working with us. And I remember, like, that was like my first exposure to kind of being on the ice with a player. I actually signed up for an adult hockey league in my free time when I could play, and I got into the skating aspect, and then I was doing a lot of rehab skates. And I just remember seeing you doing that in Montreal and being inspired by that, if that makes sense.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny actually. I'll give you the long story short around that, which is as I mentioned, when I went to the Islanders, I was the NHL was starting to spool up on strength coaches, but a lot of the strength coaches were guys who had worked in football, because football
Hmm.
was the big leader in hiring and developing strength and conditioning coaches back in the 90s. Still is to a degree, but I was the first guy that they interviewed out of 16 guys who actually could skate.
Okay.
And I wasn't a great skater. I mean, as I mentioned before, I wasn't a guy who played in the NHL or major junior hockey. I was good enough to get on the ice and move around and had good enough skills to be functional, but I was by no means a great player. But I could skate and I could get on the ice, and they wanted that capacity. Um, Ironically, when I was in, so I got my job mostly because of that,
Wow.
and that was a kind of a lucky reality. But the funny thing about the Islanders was, I never got to skate anybody on the ice for quite a while. But then, and
Mm.
this is one of those kind of moments where you screw up and you go, God, I got to know more than what I'm doing right now. So, segue back to the hockey conference, Pete Twist did a whole workshop on, you know, hockey speed development and power development. And you'll remember back in those days, shoots and toe bands and all these things were a big thing. People were
Mhm.
experimenting with them, playing with them. So I thought this was the bee's knees of stuff that I had to have to do this. And I really didn't know what the F I was doing, but I was gonna, yeah, okay, I'm gonna get into this. So I get all this gear, and so I finally one day Mike Milbury says to me, and I don't know if you ever met Mike, but Mike's a classic Boston guy, you know. So he's like, Scotty, go on the ice and skate Mike Huff. And Mike Huff was one of these old school guy, had been in the league for 18 years. This was back end of his career. He was, you know, a B player who was gonna, you know, most of the time was just gonna do, you know, game day skates and then the workout at night. And you've worked with those guys before, and you have to be sort of touchy feely with them because they know
Yeah.
their career's over. But so I got to skate Mike, and I go out and I've got, can I swear on this podcast?
Sure. Yeah.
So I've got fucking, the tow ropes and the chutes and all this shit. I come out, I don't have any pucks. I have all this shit, and I start hooking him up to this stuff, and he looks at me and he's like, "The fuck is this kid doing?" And I'm like, I'm not even a kid at this point. I'm 35, but I'm like a kid in a candy store in
Yeah.
the NHL going, okay, what do I got to do? And I start skating him with the bands and everything. And Mike Milbury's watching me, and Mike Huff's getting pissed off. Like he's just pissed off. And I'm like, why is he so pissed off? So then the skate ends, and Mike Milbury kind of looks at me, kind of shakes his head, and I never skated another player that year while I was at the Islanders. So I was like, I got to figure this crap out. So then I went to the Rangers, and I would watch. Keith Acton was with the Rangers at the time, an ex player in the league and a great guy. And Keith would do most of the injury skates with guys who were coming back, and it was laps and these
Hmm.
drills and that drills, but there was no he had no sense of how if you guy had an MCL, what you might want to start with and stuff.
Yeah.
So that was already kind of hittery skittery on the way guys were doing this. It was basically they were taking them over when they were going to get them in shape, and then it was just kind of let's bag skate them until they were ready to go again. So I kept watching, and I started to learn the drills, like what were the drills that different player positions had to do. And I started to get more and more interested in how players, the differences in the different positions. And you might like in the hockey conference, one of the things I noticed very early on was everybody used to train goalies the exact same way as they would train skaters. And I was like, this is bizarre. Like these guys don't do anything the same as a skater. And so I started training goalies differently than skaters. I would do a lot of different kinds of drill work and in the gym. I would work on different acumen and capacities and stuff. And and so my conference workshop was all on goalie off ice training. And so I started watching what the goalie coaches, and this was kind of when you had the Francois Allaire guys
Yeah.
and different guys were starting to do, Butterfly was starting to grow a little bit. And so I started to watch what were the drills that the coaches would use to warm these guys up and prepare them and get their technique down. And I would watch, the D drills when they would be injured, and the forward drills, and they were different, and you'd have the open pivots to the corners and stuff. So then when I went to Montreal, I kind of had an open canvas of, and I knew the training staff there very intimately. The head therapist, Graham Reinben, actually was a student of mine, kind of like Reg was.
Wow.
So, so Graham and I had a great relationship, and he trusted me, and I had this kind of open canvas. And I just took the bull by the horns and said, I'm going to do the skates. And, for the first number of times that I would do it, I was scared shitless that, I couldn't pass, I couldn't receive a pass. And I'd have the old curmudgeonly pro who, was maybe not so happy about the passes I would make. And then I'd work with a guy who maybe was really patient and would help me with my passing, and I would get better at it. I'd learn how to, front the pass in the guy and kind of meet him where he was. And I started to learn the game a little bit more, and I started to learn the positions. And I tell this long-winded story, sorry, but basically to clarify that as I was doing this, I was learning more about the game. I was learning more about the positional demands. I was learning more, and I was gaining respect with the players because they could see I knew about the game. I wasn't just this guy in the gym who was making them lift weights. I was this guy who understood the whole continuum and respected what they had to do, respected the load they had on the ice, respected what we were trying to do in the gym. And I think that really made a difference in the success of my career while I was in the league. Was guys knew I had their back when it was, when they were coming back. We weren't going to put them back until they were ready. And
Mhm.
I usually did all of the training on the ice until the point at which they could actually go into a practice, and we knew they would be practicing non-contact, but the coach knew that the guy could do most of the drills, and then we would add contact in and things like that. So I learned to skate and learned about every position. And by the end of my career, was one of the things that I really wanted to be able to do, was to be able to go out and injury skate any player of any position and any combination there. And so it was fun. You'd have a goalie and two defensemen and a forward that were injured, and you'd have to figure out how you would entertain them for an
Yeah.
hour on the ice, right? While the team
Yeah.
was away, and have some fun. And those days honestly are the only thing I miss most about being in pro hockey. Was the days the team was away and there were four guys back and we were skating, and then we'd have sushi or pizza afterwards, and we'd shoot the shit in the dressing room and laugh. And I'd have one guy on a treatment table and I'd be doing some work on him, and then another guy come in, and then I'd say, hey, your workout's on the board, and then I'd kind of go in and nurse that through. And those were fun days. I used to love doing that.
Yeah. That's awesome. Reminds me, when I was doing that, we had a player named Todd Marchant who we devised a rehab skating plan because he was
Mhm.
hurt for a little bit as well as Francois and three other guys who were like, we had these other three players who were on the roster but weren't going to play in games. So it was like total salary cap circumvention back when the salary cap started. So, Todd and I devised a plan. We had all the drills, and it helped me um see the game and feel, learn the positions like you said. I thought that was awesome. And what's funny too is I remember that it was no longer, this is where I felt like kind of empowered. It was no longer the head coach or the GM asking the head athletic trainer when so and so was ready. They were
Mm,
coming to me
mm,
like, "Hey, when can he practice? Or can he shoot one timers yet?" And I'm like, "Man, like I better be right." And so then,
right.
but then you have that intuitive feeling in your gut telling you what is right and wrong, and so you trust that. So that was
Right.
a lot of fun. And I'll tell you, you mentioned something about, when you have, we had a situation where we made the playoffs. We had our playoff position locked, and there was like a 1 game road trip to like San Jose or something. So imagine this: I'm on the ice playing a 3-on-3 scrimmage. We had Niedermeyer, Solani, Marchant, Getzloff, and I think the other guys who were like, "No, I'm not missing a game." They went and played, but like we had these Hall of Famers, current, future Hall of Famers on the ice, and there's me trying to keep up with these guys. And it's funny you mentioned that because that was an absolute blast that I'll never forget those days. So that's
That's
awesome you
amazing.
meant that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell me, in the last 30 years, what have you seen change in the NHL or in
Mm.
sports performance?
A lot of things have changed over time. I think there's been a recognition over the last 30 years. In the 80s, it was a cardiovascular kind of upgrade. So you had all the physiologists like the Norm Gledhills and the Howie Wengers and all these guys who kind of influenced hockey.
Hmm.
VO2 max was a big thing. Biking was a big thing. When I first came in the league, I had to sort of learn a lot about that because it wasn't an affinity that I owned. Learned a lot from Howie Wenger actually back in the day, both osmotically and professionally.
Did you have the Fitron
Um,
bikes? Those
yeah, had
Fitron,
the
yeah,
Fitrons. Yeah. Learned everything about building Fitron programming from Howie
yeah.
and Sergei Nemchinov in the Islanders was an old school Russian who he nearly bit my head off a few times if I didn't design the rides right and stuff. So yeah, that whole VO2 max kind of layer, and then kind of the shift in the 90s to strength training. I think the mistake that happened there, and that was because a lot of teams hired football guys, and I always say this when I'm lecturing about it, is football is a game that's 70 to 80% physical performance and 30 to you know 30% physical skill. Like there are skill positions, but at the end of the day it's all about bigger, faster, stronger, jump higher, explode, etc. And then you have the nuance of the skills. Hockey's the exact opposite. It's like
Hmm.
70% skill. That's why a guy like Wayne Gretzky could be as good as he was and not bench press more than 90 pounds. So
Right.
you had a sport that football players started training like, or football strength coaches trained like football players. And so what ended up happening in the 90s and early 2000s was this scourge of abdominal tears and groin tears, and people were getting ab repairs, all the time because nobody was training guys to change direction,
Mhm.
and to really control load through the central capacity of the body and stuff, and back stuff was problematic, etc. So that started to change big time while I was in the league. Sort of a conversion point around how you were going to train guys in the off season, and then speed started to become a bigger play. Mostly as I was leaving the league, you started to see linear speed become a bigger proposition in the game. um, I started actually before I left, started to I tried to shift both the combine and my own testing to on ice stuff. So I started doing a lot of on ice testing and trying to correlate the off ice testing results with the on ice testing results and saying, okay, somebody has a high Wingate score. Does that correlate to their ability to be anaerobically proficient on the ice? And it was all the interesting conversation was always, and I saw this in New York as an example. You had a guy who was a great skater like Brian Leach. He had a big VO2 max, but not like it wasn't 70 or anything like this, but he was a great skater. So I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
you could take a guy and make him a very efficient skater, and they would look like they had a big VO2 max, big engine, but they didn't. They just
Hmm.
skated really efficiently, and vice versa. You could have a big engine, poor skating mechanics, and you wouldn't look very fit.
Right. Right.
So hockey's kind of a funny sport that way. So all that to say that I think you started to see um, people started to analyze skating more through the late 2000s into the 2010s and stuff, and then along the same time you start to see this dovetail of technology kind of coming in. In my day, it was more heart rate monitors and starting to look at load and load monitoring, but we didn't have the GPS stuff and all this kind of things that guys were doing. And there were still some real holes in your ability to use these soft systems inside a bowl, inside of a hockey rink, and
Hmm.
the Wi-Fi and all that stuff was kind of very, neophytish and has grown over time. So now you've seen the advent of all that, the force decks, all these different toys that people have brought in, which I think are exceptionally valuable in terms of providing more objective measures and information to sort of dovetail with what you see. I think the overplay on the technology side of things is just that it's got to be informative and supportive of what you're trying to do. It shouldn't be driving what you're doing, in essence, in my viewpoint. Like if I look back at what we were just talking about, if I was doing what I was doing then now, the only difference would be that at certain times I would be both on a daily basis and on an incremental, timelines basis. I would do some data pulling and start to see, is what I'm seeing lining up with what the objective measures are telling me. So when I go on the ice and I see the guy maybe favoring a left hand crossover to a right hand crossover, and then I put him on the force deck, and he's still 15% off on his power production on the right leg. I know we've still got some work to do there. I can see it on the ice, but now I'm getting an objective measure that's telling me that that's the truth as well off the ice, right?
Hmm.
But I think where you start to make decisions on everybody's performance around, it was the same thing with off ice data from testing, when
Right.
there, and that was the big, you know, shitty conversations early in our lives with coaches was, you do all this data testing at the start of the season, and you build this big report for the coaches, and they'd look at it and go, thanks. And then hockey camp would start and nobody would give
Yeah.
a fuck.
Right.
So at the end of the day, you have to make it practical and valuable to everybody, the
Hmm.
players, the coaches, yourself. You have to bring it in a language that actually it makes people understand the value proposition of it. And you have to get a little less attached to, you know, the glory of the technology and really say, what is it telling me? And how is it supporting what I need to know and how I can make a little bit better decisions, and I think when you use it that way, it's got great power.
Hmm. That's awesome. Scotty, tell the listeners about, what you're up to these days. Talk about reconditioning, all of that for us.
Yeah, well, as I said, back in '04, my wife and I started teaching reconditioning, and about 10 years later, we really dove into it and built this program. And really, reconditioning is a operating program for how you bring the worlds of therapy, performance, and neuroscience together in one kind of package. So a lot of times people will go out and take all kinds of different disparate courses, but they don't know how to, integrate them. And they don't know how to integrate what they're learning in performance with what they're learning maybe from a therapeutic perspective. So I always looked at it as people would say to me, how do I do what you do? And I'd say, well, you could read all these books and you could do all these courses. So my viewpoint was, let's build a course that does it for you. It brings all that together. It doesn't push anything away. It acknowledges what people are doing and says, okay, how do you use, you know, whether it's ART or MET or needling or this type of exercise or BFR or whatever. When do you bring these things in? When don't you? Why do you do them? Why don't you? When do you choose to do this? What's more important when? So that's really the essence of reconditioning, is to help somebody, instead of having to go and take 97 different courses, is to help you, think through it and do it and give you a framework of how to analyze movement, make better decisions, clean up movement, and make people better movers. So we've been teaching that for the last 10 years heavy. And we have a course curriculum. It's 3 courses, R1, R2, R3. It's integrated with applied neurology. We're teaching people how to look at vision, vestibular systems, brain science stuff. It's really a very cool curriculum. And I would encourage people to think about, coming and joining us in this parade of fun that we're having.
Right.
The other toy, which you're aware of and have been on, is, the irony was, many moons ago, I never wanted to be a strength coach in AT. I wanted to be a radio talk show DJ. And so years
Wow.
later, I decided to get into podcasting, maybe a little
Yeah.
later than I probably should have. And I'm 7 years now in, almost 400 episodes, and Leave Your
Wow.
Mark is my sort of fun baby that I do on the side, and interview guys like yourself and people who've done
Yeah.
great things in human performance. And so people can catch Leave Your Mark on pretty much any streaming service. Reconditioning at reconditioninghq.com, and you can find me on Instagram, Twitter,
Yeah.
LinkedIn, all those places. So
That
that's all the stuff I'm up to.
that is awesome, Scotty, because you talked about reconditioning and your learning experience just by saying at a seminar I went to, or talking to this person or that person. It seemed like you formulated this throughout your whole career, and you were practicing it at a younger age, and doing it while not kind of, say, branding it, I should say, right? It
Mhm.
was always, you were always reconditioning athletes,
Mhm. Yeah.
and you were doing the work with learning and applying over and over again. So I think that is really freaking cool. So that's good stuff.
Thank you.
I really do.
Yeah. I think the one message I would give to your listeners is I often hear people getting into this kind of strange, nuanced conversation around specific sports training, and the guys who get their B in a knot because of it and stuff. But fundamentally, the what reconditioning is about is looking at what the human in front of me has to do with their body, understanding it, being able to assess whether they can do what they have to do efficiently and effectively. So they're not putting load on systems and tissues that they shouldn't be putting on. They're distributing the load through their whole body the way they should be, using their whole body effectively. So this is not about, you know, analyzing the golf stroke and saying, I know how to do a better golf stroke. It's about understanding where the holes in that golf stroke are that are actually potentially causing too much strain on certain tissues and end up becoming an injury or a driver of a problem. So th that's what the essence of it is. Understand what somebody has to do with their body and build programming to accomplish that. And that's bringing the power of all the stuff you learn in performance training and the things you learn in therapy so that they marry each other effectively and support one another rather than, as you have experienced and I've experienced, the two entities fighting with each other because they don't know how to talk to one another. So it
Yeah,
gives you an instrument to be able to talk to one another about the problems you're running into in a team environment or performance environment or in your own projects.
love that. I love that definition. Well, Scotty, I think, that's a good, definitely over an hour here. So this has been unbelievable. It's just been great catching up with you and seeing you in person. And yeah, thanks for coming on. I think our listeners will really appreciate this. And especially if you're a strength and conditioning coach, like I think it's important to really respect what has been done in the past
Mm.
to help us all be able to do what we're doing today. And I think we covered that quite a bit here. And so I really appreciate you coming on, pal.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. Yeah. Shout
Awesome.
out to your point. Shout out to all those guys like the Boyles, the Goldenbergs, the Twists, the Friesens, the Poliquins, and names I'm not even aware of who've contributed to hockey performance, and the guys who are now taking that baton like the Prices and the Donskovs and all these other guys and yourself and perpetuating it forward. So good on all of those people and those who I've missed mentioning, but we stand on the shoulders of great people before us who established this industry and allowed it to kind of become something that we could all earn an income in.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, Scotty, thanks again. And we'll talk to you
My
next time,
pleasure.
pal.
All right,
Appreciate it.
buddy.
Take
Yeah,
care.
anytime.
See
Yeah,
ya.
you could. Bye.
Bye now.